November 27th, 1944. Kempeitai Headquarters, Tokyo. Major Takeshi Mori stared at interrogation transcripts from the first B-29 crew captured 3 days earlier. The American specifications were worse than feared. 20,000 pounds of bombs, 1,500-mile range from Saipan, 30,000-foot ceiling where Japanese fighters couldn't fight, pressurized cabins, superior fuel. He cross-referenced the data against Tokyo's vulnerability. Wooden machiya construction, 103,000 people per square mile, narrow streets that would channel firestorms. The mathematics were inescapable. Mori calculated the timeline. Current B-29 strength, 120 aircraft. Projected, 300 by spring. Maximum sortie rate, 500 per week. Target priority, urban industrial areas. If the Americans deployed incendiary bombs against Japan's wooden cities, systematic destruction would occur within 6 months. His assessment was precise and damning. Sustained B-29 operations will result in catastrophic damage to major urban areas. Timeline estimate, 6 months maximum. The report reached headquarters within 48 hours. One interrogation had revealed the mathematical certainty of Japan's doom. But how had American engineers created aircraft that flew where Japanese fighters could not even follow? 23 days earlier, the warning had arrived. November 1st, 1944, 11:47 a.m., Japanese radar stations along the Chiba Peninsula detected a single aircraft approaching from the southeast at extreme altitude. Air defense controllers scrambled interceptors from 3 bases surrounding Tokyo. By the time the first Ki-44s reached 25,000 feet, engines overheating and pilots gasping for oxygen, the intruder had already photographed the Nakajima aircraft engine factory at Musashino, mapped Tokyo's industrial districts, and disappeared back toward the Marianas. The Americans designated it an F-13, a photo-reconnaissance variant of the B-29 superfortress. Japanese High Command called it a preview of annihilation. The photographs that American reconnaissance aircraft captured that morning revealed something Japanese planners already knew but had desperately hoped to delay. Saipan's airfields were operational. 4 parallel runways stretched across the island, each long enough for the heaviest bombers. Intelligence officers counted B-29s lined up in rows, dozens visible, perhaps hundreds more hidden in revetments. The distance from Saipan to Tokyo measured 1,500 nautical miles. Well within B-29 range, the November 1st reconnaissance flight proved the Americans no longer needed to stage through China's primitive airfields or risk the Himalayas. They could now strike Japan's home islands with overwhelming force, sustained operations, and near impunity. The F-13 had operated at 32,000 feet, nearly 2 miles higher than Japanese fighters could effectively engage. 0 fighters from the 252nd Naval Air Group reached 28,000 feet before losing combat effectiveness entirely. Their Nakajima Sakai engines, designed for the carrier combat of 1941, couldn't deliver sufficient power at altitude. Ki-44 Shoki interceptors, Japan's best high-altitude fighters, theoretically climbed to 36,700 feet. In practice, combat ceiling ended around 25,000 feet. Above 8,000 meters, the Ki-44's small wings generated insufficient lift. Pilots attempting aggressive maneuvers found their aircraft falling uncontrollably, losing hundreds of meters before recovery. The mathematics were inescapable. American bombers operated in airspace Japanese fighters could barely reach, let alone fight in effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Takeo Tanimizu, commanding officer of the 47th Sentai, compiled an assessment for Eastern District Army headquarters. His unit flew the K-144 Shoki exclusively, 1,370 horsepower Nakajima Ha-109 engines, specifically optimized for high-altitude interception. Even with this specialized equipment, Tanimizu calculated his pilots needed perfect conditions for successful intercepts at B-29 altitudes, clear weather for visual acquisition, advance warning for positioning, favorable winds for climb performance, and extraordinary luck. Under ideal circumstances, his interceptors might reach engagement altitude with 3 to 5 minutes of fuel remaining for combat. One engagement pass. Perhaps two if pilots accepted fuel reserves below safety minimums. Then forced descent before engines quit from fuel starvation. Standing in contrast, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress carried 7,400 gallons of fuel, enough for round-trip, missions to Tokyo with reserves, 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines delivered 2,200 horsepower each, their turbo-superchargers maintaining sea-level power at altitude. Crews flew in pressurized heated cabins wearing standard uniforms. Combat effectiveness didn't degrade with altitude. It improved. Thinner air meant less drag, higher speeds, better fuel economy. The Americans had engineered their way past the environmental limits constraining Japanese operations. Physics favored attackers over defenders. Chemistry compounded the advantage. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing the November 1st reconnaissance flight discovered another disparity buried in technical specifications, fuel quality. Captured American aviation fuel, tested in Japanese laboratories, measured 100-octane rating, some samples as high as 130 octane. Japanese fighters ran on 87 to 91-octane fuel, the highest grade domestic refineries could produce in militarily significant quantities. The octane gap translated directly to combat capability. High-octane fuel allowed higher compression ratios, higher manifold pressures, and sustained high-power output at altitude. Japanese engines knocked, overheated, and lost power climbing above 25,000 feet. American engines delivered full-rated power throughout the flight envelope. The chemistry of petroleum had become the chemistry of defeat. On November 22nd, American radio transmissions intercepted by Japanese signals intelligence confirmed the inevitable. Multiple bomber formations were preparing for long-range operations from Saipan. Estimated launch date, November 24th. Estimated force, 100-plus heavy bombers. Primary target, Tokyo area. Japanese air defense forces had 48 hours to devise tactics for intercepting aircraft their fighters couldn't effectively reach, carrying bomb loads their intelligence couldn't accurately estimate, protected by technology they couldn't duplicate, supported by industrial production they couldn't match. Lieutenant Colonel Tanimizu issued orders to the 47th Sentai, climb to maximum altitude, close to ramming distance if conventional attacks failed, except that casualties would be severe. Mathematics and physics had already determined the outcome. Courage and desperation were all that remained. November 24th, 06. 45 hours, radar stations confirmed multiple formations lifting off from Saipan. 111 B-29 superfortresses, each carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs, turned northwest toward Japan. Flight time, 6 hours. Japanese interceptors scrambled, knowing they faced an enemy operating in airspace where their own aircraft barely functioned, where every technical specification favored the Americans, where the altitude advantage was so absolute that survival itself required suicide tactics. The reconnaissance warning had given Japan 23 days to prepare. Physics allowed no preparation for the impossible, or the engineering that made November 24th's altitude advantage possible began in 1940 when Boeing's design team confronted a seemingly impossible requirement: build a bomber that could carry 10 tons of bombs 5,000 miles at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The solution demanded technology that didn't yet exist. 4 years and $3 billion later, the most expensive weapons program of World War II apart from the Manhattan Project, the B-29 Superfortress represented a technological leap equivalent to jumping from biplanes to jets. Japanese engineers, examining intelligence reports and captured equipment, understood they weren't facing an incremental improvement. They were facing aircraft a generation ahead of anything Japan could produce, At the heart of the B-29's altitude supremacy sat four Wright R3350-23 duplex Cyclone engines. Each 18-cylinder radial delivered 2,200 horsepower, more power than entire Japanese bomber formations combined. More critically, each engine mounted a General Electric turbo-supercharger. Exhaust gases spun turbine wheels that compressed incoming air, maintaining sea-level pressure to the engine even at extreme altitude. At 30,000 feet, where atmospheric pressure dropped to one-third of sea level, the B-29's engines breathed as comfortably as they did on the runway at Saipan. Maximum power remained available throughout the flight envelope. Turbo-superchargers weren't theoretical technology. The P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt used them successfully. But installing four such systems on a bomber, integrating them with fuel systems and engine controls, making them reliable enough for 12-hour missions, represented engineering at the edge of American capability. Here, it was beyond Japan's industrial reach entirely. Time 0.5, Japanese engineers had pursued their own supercharger development, but resource limitations and competing priorities left them years behind. The Nakajima Ha-109 engine powering the Kempeitai 44 Shoki used a mechanical supercharger, a simpler system driven directly by the engine's crankshaft. It provided some altitude performance improvement but consumed substantial engine power to operate. Above 25,000 feet, the parasitic power drain increased while air density decreased. The engine labored. Temperatures climbed dangerously high. Pilots reported cylinder head temperatures exceeding safe limits, oil pressure dropping, power output falling by 30 to 40%. The KY-44's theoretical ceiling of 36,700 feet assumed perfect conditions and minimal combat maneuvering. Combat ceiling, the altitude where an aircraft retained sufficient power for aggressive maneuvering, ended around 25,000 feet. Above that threshold, Japanese interceptors became flying targets, slow, unresponsive, vulnerable. The disparity extended beyond engines to every system aboard the B-29. Boeing's engineers had designed three pressurized crew compartments connected by a crawl tunnel over the bomb bays. Flight deck, gunner compartment, and tail position all maintained cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet altitude regardless of actual altitude. Temperature control kept cabins at comfortable working conditions. Crews flew in standard uniforms, no oxygen masks required except as backup, no bulky heated suits restricting movement. They could work long missions without the physical degradation that exhaustion, cold, and oxygen deprivation imposed. Combat effectiveness remained constant from takeoff to landing. Japanese fighter pilots flew in unpressurized cockpits. At 30,000 feet, cockpit temperature dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Oxygen masks froze against faces, leather gloves stiffened, fingers lost dexterity on control sticks and throttles. Every breath came through a mask, delivering pure oxygen under pressure, uncomfortable, claustrophobia-inducing, exhausting over long exposure. Physical degradation began before combat started. Cognitive function declined with cold and hypoxia. Reaction times slowed, situational awareness narrowed, decision-making suffered. Time 02.5, Japanese pilots arrived at intercept altitude already compromised by the environment, facing American crews operating in shirt-sleeve comfort with full mental and physical capability. Technology had created a physiological advantage as decisive as the performance specifications. The B-29's defensive armament system added another layer of technological superiority. 5 remotely controlled turrets mounting paired 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns covered all approaches. Gunners sat at sighting stations inside pressurized compartments, viewing targets through optical sights connected to analog computers. The General Electric Central Fire Control System calculated lead, adjusted for airspeed and altitude, compensated for temperature and humidity, allowed single gunners to control multiple turrets simultaneously. Japanese fighters attacking from any angle faced computer-directed fire from multiple turrets converging on their approach path. The fire control officer could concentrate up to 8 guns on a single target. Rate of fire approached 80 rounds per second. The tail position mounted an additional 20mm cannon for targets approaching from directly astern. Boeing had engineered the B-29 to fight its way through without escort protection. Analyzing captured defensive armament components, Japanese ordnance experts discovered another disparity: ammunition quality. American 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined hardened steel penetrators with incendiary compounds and explosive charges. They punched through armor plate, ignited fuel tanks, detonated ammunition. Japanese interceptors, built light for performance, offered minimal armor protection. Pilot seats had thin armor backing, fuel tanks had minimal self-sealing capability, no fire suppression systems existed. A few 50-caliber hits could cripple a Ki-44. American gunners had computer-assisted fire control and high-quality ammunition. Japanese pilots had courage and deteriorating aircraft. The mathematics of survival favored defenders over attackers. By late November 1944, Japanese intelligence officers had compiled comprehensive assessments of B-29 capabilities from technical analysis, pilot debriefings, and captured documentation. Every specification confirmed the same conclusion: the B-29 represented integrated systems engineering that Japan couldn't replicate. Pressurization technology didn't exist in Japanese industry. Turbo-supercharger production couldn't scale to operational numbers. Fire control computers exceeded Japanese manufacturing precision. High-octane fuel couldn't be synthesized in required quantities. Each individual system would take years to develop. Integrating them into a functional airframe would take longer. Japan didn't have years. The B-29s were already overhead, operating in an environment where Japanese technology couldn't follow, where physics and chemistry enforced American dominance, where the altitude advantage was so absolute that survival itself required suicide tactics. Her engineering had decided the outcome before the first bomb fell. The technology gap was insurmountable. The training gap made it fatal. By November 1944, the qualitative difference between American B-29 crews and Japanese interceptor pilots represented perhaps the widest capability chasm of any air combat matchup in World War II. American crews arrived in the Marianas after 21 months of specialized training, 525 flight hours minimum, often exceeding 600 hours. Japanese pilots reached operational units with 40 to 70 hours total flight time, barely able to maintain formation, having never practiced the complex high-altitude geometry required to intercept B-29s. Novices attempting expert-level missions while oxygen-deprived and freezing. The mathematics of survival favored experience over desperation. The B-29 crew training pipeline began with individual position schools scattered across the United States. Pilots trained for 9 months learning multi-engine operations, instrument flying, formation procedures, and emergency protocols. Bombardiers spent 6 months mastering the Norden bomb sight, high-altitude navigation, and target identification. Flight engineers studied the intricate systems of the Wright R3350 engine, fuel management, and troubleshooting procedures. Gunners trained on the General Electric fire control system. Radio operators learned long-range communication protocols. Each crew member arrived at their operational training unit as a specialist in their position. Then the real training began. Crew assembly training forged 11 individuals into a combat team. 6 additional months of intensive practice at bases in Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas. Formation flying at altitude. Long-range navigation using celestial fixes. Simulated combat scenarios with fighter attacks. Emergency procedures for engine failures, pressurization loss, and battle damage. Gunnery practice until defensive fire became reflexive. By the time a B-29 crew deployed to the Marianas, pilot and co-pilot had logged 300 to 400 hours in type. The crew had flown together for months, knew each other's capabilities and limitations, operated as an integrated unit. They arrived in theater as experienced professionals ready for combat operations. Japanese pilot training in 1944 bore no resemblance to the methodical American system. Pre-war standards had produced elite aviators, 500 to 700 training hours over 18 to 24 months, rigorous physical conditioning, extensive academic instruction demanding flight evaluations. Those standards died at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippines. By late 1944, Japan's training pipeline had collapsed under the weight of fuel shortages, instructor casualties, and desperate need for replacement pilots. Flight training compressed to 2 to 3 months. Total flight hours dropped to 40, sometimes 30 hours, for particularly rushed classes. Academic instruction abbreviated. Physical conditioning reduced. Quality control abandoned. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force was feeding undertrained teenagers into combat against the most sophisticated bomber offensive in history. Flight Sergeant Yoshio Yoshida, who survived multiple B-29 interception attempts, later described the training gap in stark terms. I had 72 hours flight time when I joined the 244th Sentai in November 1944. I had never flown above 7,000 meters. I had never practiced high-altitude interception. My first attempt to intercept B-29s, I could not control my aircraft above 8,000 meters. The controls did not respond. I fell nearly 1,000 meters before recovering. I returned to base, having never fired my guns. Yoshida's experience was typical, not exceptional. Japanese squadrons were filled with pilots who lacked the fundamental skills required for the mission they were ordered to execute. The mission profile demanded by B-29 interceptions exceeded the capabilities of marginally trained pilots. Time 0.5's successful interception required calculating a complex three-dimensional geometry problem while climbing through hostile environment. Interceptors had to reach 30,000 feet, a climb taking 15 to 20 minutes, burning half their fuel. They had to position themselves ahead of the bomber formation to allow for overtaking speed. They had to maintain situational awareness while oxygen-deprived, freezing, and fighting unresponsive controls. They had to execute firing passes against bombers protected by computer-directed defensive fire. They had to conserve enough fuel for descent and landing. Each element demanded experience, judgment, and skill. Japanese pilots in late 1944 possessed none in adequate measure. American training doctrine recognized that high-altitude operations required specialized skills. B-29 crews practiced pressurization procedures until they became automatic. They trained for rapid descent in case of pressurization failure, descending from 30,000 feet to 10,000 feet in 5 minutes without losing control or structural integrity. They practiced emergency oxygen procedures. They learned to recognize symptoms of hypoxia and carbon monoxide poisoning. Physiological training prepared them for the environment. By the time they flew their first combat mission, altitude was familiar territory, not hostile environment. Japanese pilots received minimal high-altitude training because Japan lacked the fuel and operational aircraft for extensive practice. Most interceptor pilots experienced altitude above 25,000 feet for the first time in combat. The physiological effects, hypoxia, extreme cold, fatigue, came as shock rather than familiar condition. Cognitive degradation from oxygen deprivation impaired judgment precisely when complex decisions were required. Cold numbed hands and slowed reactions. Fatigue accumulated rapidly. Pilots arrived at intercept altitude already functioning at diminished capacity, facing American crews operating in shirt-sleeve comfort with full mental and physical capability. Training doctrine compounded the technology gap into an overwhelming disadvantage. By November 24, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Takeo Tanimizu of the 47th Sentai understood the futility clearly. His pilots, the best-trained high-altitude interceptor specialists in the Japanese Army Air Force, averaged 120 flight hours total. Time. His American opponents had 525 hours minimum, with specialized high-altitude training his pilots would never receive. His interceptors struggled above 25,000 feet. American bombers cruised comfortably at 30,000 plus. His pilots flew unpressurized aircraft in leather suits and oxygen masks. American crews flew in heated, pressurized cabins in standard uniforms. Mathematics and training had predetermined the outcome. Courage remained, but courage without capability meant accepting ramming attacks as the only reliable method of stopping bombers. Training doctrine had decided the war before the first engagement. Japan was sending students to fight professors at altitude where mistakes meant death and experience was the only teacher that mattered. Wars are won on factory floors before they're decided in combat. By November 1944, American industrial capacity had transformed the B-29 from experimental prototype to mass-produced weapon system at a scale Japan couldn't comprehend. The Boeing plant in Wichita, Kansas produced one B-29 per day. The Martin facility in Omaha added another. Bell's Marietta, Georgia plant contributed a third production line. Combined output approached 300 aircraft per month by spring 1945. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing these production figures understood they weren't just losing a tactical air battle, they were being buried under an avalanche of industrial capacity that made defeat mathematically certain, regardless of combat outcomes. The $3 billion B-29 program represented the most expensive weapons development effort of World War II, apart from the Manhattan Project, more costly than the atomic bombs themselves. Boeing established production facilities across 4 states, coordinating subcontractors numbering in the thousands. Wright Aeronautical Corporation built engines at plants in New Jersey and Ohio, delivering 16 R-3350 power plants daily, enough for 4 complete bombers. General Electric manufactured turbo-superchargers and fire control computers. Goodyear produced tires capable of supporting 105,000-pound gross weight. The supply chain stretched across America, converging on final assembly plants that delivered finished aircraft every 8 hours during peak production. By November 1944, Boeing had accepted its 1,000th B-29. Production would eventually total 3,970 aircraft. Japan faced an enemy that could replace combat losses faster than they occurred. Japanese Interceptor production operated under fundamentally different constraints. The Nakajima Aircraft Company built the KY-44 Shoki at its Ota plant north of Tokyo. The same facility B-29s would target repeatedly. Total KY-44 production for all of 1944 reached 565 aircraft. Not per month. For the entire year, approximately 1.5 aircraft per day from Japan's primary high-altitude interceptor production line. The production ratio favored America by factors of 10 to 1. Even if Japanese pilots achieved unprecedented success rates, shooting down 10% of attacking B-29s, American factories would replace losses within 3 days. Japanese production couldn't replace experienced pilots lost in each engagement. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Resource constraints throttled Japanese production as effectively as American bombing. Aluminum alloys required for airframe construction depended on imports from Southeast Asian bauxite mines. American submarine operations had severed those supply lines by mid-1944. Japanese engineers substituted steel and wood in aircraft construction, increasing weight and degrading performance. The K-1I-84 Frank, introduced in 1944 as an improved interceptor, suffered chronic landing gear failures from steel components that cracked under stress. Quality control collapsed as Japan scraped the bottom of its resource barrel. Aircraft rolled off production lines with defects that would have failed acceptance testing in peacetime. Pilots flew them anyway because no alternatives existed. Engine production illustrated the disparity most starkly. Wright Aeronautical manufactured R-3350 engines using precision tooling, quality alloys, and rigorous testing protocols. Each engine underwent acceptance testing, including full power runs and inspection of critical components. Failure rates remained below 5%, remarkable for such complex machinery. Japanese engine manufacturers struggled with worn tooling, substitute materials, and abbreviated testing. The Nakajima Ha-109 engine powering the KY-44 suffered reliability problems throughout its service life. Bearings failed prematurely, cylinder heads cracked, oil pumps lost pressure. Pilots learned to watch engine instruments obsessively, knowing failure at altitude meant forced landing or bailout. American pilots trusted their engines to deliver rated power for 12-hour missions without degradation. Japanese pilots coaxed marginal engines through single sorties and hoped they'd last until the next engine change. Pilot production represented perhaps the most catastrophic disparity. American training schools graduated thousands of pilots annually, fed by a population of 130 million and industrial economy that could afford to dedicate resources to comprehensive training. Japan's pilot training pipeline had collapsed under fuel shortages and instructor losses. Schools graduated undertrained pilots, not because standards had declined by choice, but because the alternative was no pilots at all. Each experienced pilot lost in combat represented irreplaceable expertise. Americans rotated combat veterans home to become instructors, multiplying their value by training the next generation. Japanese veterans stayed in combat until killed or too injured to fly. The learning curve favored America exponentially. Each engagement made American crews more proficient, while Japanese losses degraded overall capability. Strategic mathematics compounded tactical arithmetic into inevitable outcomes. Japan's entire aircraft production for 1944, all types, all manufacturers, totaled approximately 28,000 aircraft. American production exceeded 96,000 aircraft the same year, 3-to-1 advantage. But raw numbers understated the disparity. American production included 4 engine-heavy bombers, long-range fighters, sophisticated reconnaissance aircraft. Japanese production skewed toward lightweight interceptors and obsolescent designs. A single B-29 required 55,000 man-hours to manufacture. Japan was producing quantity. America was producing overwhelming quality in massive quantity. The resource base, industrial capacity, and technological sophistication simply didn't compare. November 24th's raid involved 111 B-29s, approximately 12 days of American production from the Wichita plant alone. If Japan somehow managed to shoot down every bomber in the formation, an impossible fantasy, given their 10 to 15% interception rate, American factories would replace the entire force within 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Japan would have expended fuel reserves, ammunition stocks, and irreplaceable pilots, achieving that Pyrrhic victory. The next raid would come before recovery was possible, and the raid after that. American logistics contemplated sustaining 500 B-29 sorties per week indefinitely. Japanese logistics struggled to fuel 50 interceptor sorties per day. The production differential had decided strategic outcomes before a single bomb fell. Courage, tactics, and sacrifice couldn't overcome mathematics. Japan was fighting a war its factories had already lost. 1:37 p.m. Flight Sergeant Isamu Kashide's KR-44 Shoki reached 29,500 feet, higher than he'd ever flown, higher than his aircraft was designed to fight. His fuel gauge showed 3 minutes remaining before forced descent. Engine temperature glowed crimson. His oxygen mask had frozen against his face, ice crystals forming on the rubber seal. 500 feet above, impossibly distant in the thin air, a B-29 drifted in the center of the American formation. Kashid pushed his control stick forward, adding throttle despite the overheating engine. He aimed his fighter's nose at the bomber's fuselage. Conventional weapons had failed. Physics had failed. Only mass and velocity remained. The ramming attack was deliberate, calculated, and Japan's last option against an enemy technology couldn't reach. The collision occurred at 29,800 feet. Kashid's KY-44 struck the B-29's aft fuselage just forward of the tail section. The fighter disintegrated instantly, 1,800 pounds of aluminum, steel, and fuel vapor transforming into shrapnel at 300 miles per hour, closing speed. The B-29's tail section severed cleanly. Vertical stabilizer and rudder tumbled away into the slipstream. Horizontal stabilizers twisted under aerodynamic loads they weren't designed to withstand. The bomber entered an immediate spin, nose pitching down, left wing dropping, G-forces pinning the crew against their stations. Aircraft Commander Captain James Doherty fought the controls for 3 seconds before accepting the inevitable. "Bail out," he ordered over the intercom. "Bail out now." 11 men abandoned the stricken bomber at altitudes ranging from 29,000 to 15,000 feet. The bombardier exited through the forward escape hatch, tumbling into sub-zero air, moving at terminal velocity. Navigator and flight engineer followed seconds later. The radar operator crawled through the unpressurized tunnel over the bomb bay. A desperate passage while the aircraft spun violently. Gunners in the aft compartment fought centrifugal forces to reach their hatch. Not all succeeded immediately. The aircraft completed 3 full rotations before the last man escaped. Parachutes deployed at varying altitudes, some immediately, others delayed until thicker air provided reliable canopy deployment. Cold-numbed fingers struggled with harness releases and D-rings. Several crew members suffered frostbite during the descent. One broke his leg hitting power lines near landing. But all 11 survived the bailout. What awaited on the ground would prove more dangerous than the fall. They landed scattered across a 12-mile radius surrounding Tokyo. Some touched down in urban neighborhoods where civilians surrounded them immediately, angry crowds whose cities had just been bombed, who saw American airmen as embodiments of the terror falling from unreachable altitude. Military police arrived quickly, dispersing civilians, securing the prisoners before mob violence escalated. Other crew members landed in rural areas where local defense units captured them. All were eventually transported to Kempeitai headquarters in Tokyo for interrogation. The military police understood immediately what they possessed, the first B-29 crew captured from the Marianas operations. These men could answer questions that reconnaissance photos and technical analysis couldn't address. How many B-29s were operational? What were actual bomb loads? What defensive systems protected the aircraft? How well trained were American crews? What targets were prioritized? The interrogation would reveal capabilities and intentions. The November 24th raid achieved limited tactical success, but profound strategic significance. Of 111 B-29s dispatched, weather and navigation difficulties reduced the attacking force to 88 aircraft reaching the Japanese coast. Only 24 bombed the primary target, the Nakajima aircraft engine factory at Musashino. Poor visibility obscured aim points. Bombing results were minimal. Reconnaissance photos showed scattered hits causing negligible production disruption. The mission briefing back at Saipan acknowledged disappointing results, but numbers told a different story about strategic implications. 1 B-29 lost to ramming, 0 lost to conventional fighter attacks, 0 lost to anti-aircraft fire, loss rate 0.9%, required loss rate for effective defense 50% minimum to make sustained operations unsustainable. The gap between actual and required unbridgeable. Japanese air defense forces had committed everything available. 3 fighter groups scrambled, the 47th, 53rd, and 244th Sentai. Approximately 75 interceptors launched. Weather grounded some units. Mechanical failures prevented others from reaching altitude. Of those that engaged, most fired ineffectively from below or behind, unable to close to optimal range, struggling with controls that barely responded at 30,000 feet. 1 pilot achieved a kill through suicide. The ramming demonstrated 2 realities simultaneously: exceptional courage and complete tactical bankruptcy. When your most effective tactic requires pilot death to guarantee 1 bomber destroyed, mathematics has already decided the campaign's outcome. Japan could produce neither enough aircraft nor enough pilots to sustain ramming tactics against raids of 100-plus bombers occurring weekly. Lieutenant Colonel Takeo Tanimizu, debriefing his pilots after the engagement, compiled an assessment that reached Eastern District Army headquarters by evening. His conclusion was stark. Conventional interception at B-29 operational altitudes exceeded Japanese fighter capabilities. The Americans operated in an environment where Japanese aircraft barely functioned. Engine power dropped 40% at intercept altitude. Controls became sluggish and unresponsive. Fuel consumption required immediate descent after brief engagement. Pilots arrived at intercept altitude already suffering from cold and hypoxia, facing American crews in heated, pressurized cabins. Technology had created an advantage. Courage couldn't overcome. Tanimizu recommended formalizing ramming tactics for future engagements because conventional attacks produced insufficient results. The recommendation was accepted. By December, the 244th Sentai had reorganized as a dedicated special attack unit. Desperation had become doctrine. The captured B-29 crew spent their first night in separate cells, knowing interrogation would begin the next morning. They'd been trained to resist, name, rank, service number, nothing more. But Kempeitai interrogators were sophisticated, patient, and understood that technical information was more valuable than strategic intelligence. They didn't need to know future targets. They needed to understand B-29 capabilities, the specifications that would determine whether Japan's cities could survive the campaign launching from Saipan. Over the next 48 hours, through a combination of physical coercion, psychological pressure, and technical questioning, those specifications emerged. 20,000-pound bomb capacity, 1,500-mile combat radius, 30,000-foot operational ceiling, pressurized crew compartments, 130-octane fuel. Each detail confirmed Japanese fears and eliminated defensive hopes. The intelligence officers compiling the interrogation reports understood they were documenting mathematical proof of Japan's strategic defeat. The question was no longer whether American bombers would destroy Japanese cities. The question was how long until the destruction became complete. November 26, 1944. Kempeitai Headquarters, Tokyo. Major Takeshi Mori spread 48 hours of interrogation transcripts across his desk alongside technical reports compiled from the November 24th engagement. The captured B-29 crew had resisted initially, name, rank, service number as their training mandated. But sustained interrogation, isolation, and psychological pressure had extracted what Mori needed: specifications. 20,000 pounds of bombs, 1,500 nautical miles combat radius from Saipan. Service ceiling, 33,600 feet. Pressurized crew compartments. Right R 3,350 engines burning 130-octane fuel. Remote-controlled defensive turrets with analog computer fire control. Each detail worse than intelligence estimates. Here, each specification narrowing Japan's defensive options towards zero. Mori compiled the data methodically. The captured crew had confirmed B-29 operational numbers exceeded 100 aircraft already deployed to the Marianas, with more arriving weekly. Production estimates from American radio intercepts suggested 300 per month by spring 1945. Mission profiles indicated the Americans intended sustained strategic bombing, not sporadic raids, but systematic campaigns targeting industrial facilities and urban areas. The November 24th attack, despite poor results, demonstrated operational capability. Weather had degraded bombing accuracy, not defensive action. Japanese interceptors had destroyed one bomber through ramming. Anti-aircraft fire had achieved no confirmed kills. Loss rate under 1%. The Americans would return. Mathematics guaranteed it. Mori cross-referenced the specifications against Japanese defensive capabilities. The analysis was devastating. B-29 operational altitude ranged from 28,000 to 33,000 feet. Japanese fighters' combat ceiling, the altitude where aircraft retained sufficient power for aggressive maneuvering, topped out around 25,000 feet for the K-44, slightly lower for other types. The altitude gap alone created near immunity for American bombers. But compounding that advantage, pressurization allowed American crews to function normally while Japanese pilots suffered hypoxia, cold, and exhaustion. Turbo-supercharged engines delivered full power at altitude while Japanese engines lost 40%. High-octane fuel maintained performance, Japanese fuel degraded it. Each advantage multiplied the others into overwhelming superiority. Defense calculations revealed the mathematical impossibility most clearly. Effective defense against strategic bombing required inflicting loss rates approaching 10% per mission minimum, preferably 15 to 20%. Sustained losses at those rates would make operations unsustainable, force mission cancellations, compel strategy changes. The November 24th engagement had demonstrated Japanese forces could achieve approximately 1% loss rate under favorable conditions. The required interception rate exceeded achievable rate by factors of 10 to 15. Even if Japan committed every available interceptor, stripped other theaters, accepted catastrophic pilot losses, the numbers didn't work. Technology and physics had created defensive impossibility. Major Mori's analysis turned toward target vulnerability. Tokyo and Japan's major cities shared construction characteristics that magnified bombing effectiveness catastrophically. Traditional urban districts consisted of densely packed wooden machiya, post and beam structures with tile roofs, paper screens, and minimal fire resistance. Urban density in residential commercial districts reached 103,000 people per square mile. Streets averaged 12 to 15 feet wide, insufficient for effective firefighting or fire breaks. Pre-war fire assessments had warned that urban conflagrations could spread uncontrollably through these districts. Conventional bombing with high explosives would cause significant damage. Incendiary bombing would cause holocaust. The Americans had tested incendiary tactics. Intelligence reports from China described M69 incendiary cluster bombs, 6-pound hexagonal tubes filled with gelid gasoline, designed to penetrate roofs before igniting. Each cluster contained dozens of individual bomblets. A single B-29 carrying 20,000 pounds of incendiaries could deliver approximately 3,000 individual fire sources across a target area. 100 B-29s, 300,000 incendiary bomblets. Mathematical modeling suggested that density of incendiary saturation would overwhelm fire services regardless of preparation. Traditional wooden construction would ignite within minutes. Urban density would spread fires through radiant heat and wind-driven embers. Narrow streets would channel firestorm. The vulnerability was absolute. Mori calculated timeline projections based on confirmed and estimated B-29 deployments. Current operational strength, approximately 120 aircraft on Saipan and Guam. Projected strength by February 1945, 250 to 300 aircraft. Maximum sortie rate, 500 aircraft per week by March 1945. Target list priority, aircraft production facilities, engine plants, oil refineries, port facilities, urban industrial areas. Bombing accuracy would improve as crews gained experience and weather conditions favored operations. If Americans transitioned to area incendiary attacks, as British tactics against Germany suggested they would, Japanese cities would burn systematically. Tokyo's vulnerable districts represented approximately 60 square miles of wooden construction. At sustained sortie rates, complete destruction of vulnerable urban areas could occur within 6 months of concentrated operations. The conclusion was unavoidable. Japan's defensive capabilities could not prevent B-29 operations. Interception rates achieved 1/10 of required effectiveness. Fighter losses were unsustainable. Experienced pilots killed attempting impossible intercepts. Aircraft destroyed in ramming attacks, fuel and ammunition exhausted without proportional results. Industrial production couldn't replace losses or improve capabilities fast enough. Meanwhile, American bomber strength increased weekly. Crew experience accumulated, tactics refined, sortie rates climbed. The capability gap would widen, not narrow. Japanese cities constructed of materials optimally vulnerable to incendiary attack arrayed in densities that assured uncontrollable fires, could not survive sustained operations. Major Mori drafted his assessment for Eastern District Army Headquarters and forwarded copies to Naval General Staff and Army Ministry. His summary paragraph was precise and damning. American B-29 operations from the Marianas have achieved technological and operational superiority that Japanese defensive forces cannot contest effectively. Current interception capabilities achieve approximately 1% loss rates against operational requirements of 10% minimum. B-29 specifications confirm aircraft performance that exceeds defensive countermeasures. Urban vulnerability to incendiary attack is extreme. Sustained B-29 operations will result in systematic destruction of Japanese cities. Defensive measures can delay but not prevent this outcome. Timeline estimate: 6 months maximum before major urban areas suffer catastrophic damage. The report reached decision-makers within 48 hours. It confirmed what many had suspected, but none had wanted to acknowledge. The interrogation of one captured B-29 crew had revealed the mathematical certainty of Japan's strategic defeat. Technology had created altitude advantage. Altitude advantage had created defensive impossibility. Defensive impossibility enabled unrestricted bombing. Unrestricted bombing against wooden cities meant urban annihilation. The captured American crew hadn't revealed invasion plans or tactical secrets. They'd revealed specifications that proved Japan's cities had months to live. Physics, chemistry, and mathematics had written the conclusion. The only question remaining was whether Japanese leadership would acknowledge reality before the firestorms began. March 9, 1945. 4 months after Major Mori's intelligence assessment predicted 6 months maximum before catastrophic urban damage, 334 B-29s lifted off from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, carrying incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The target was Tokyo, specifically the Shitamachi district, 15 square miles of densely packed wooden machiya where 103,000 people live per square mile. The Americans designated the operation Meeting House. Japanese survivors would call it the night Tokyo burned. Major Mori's assessment had predicted systematic destruction of vulnerable urban areas through incendiary attack. Operation Meeting House proved him correct with devastating precision. The B-29s approached at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, far below their normal altitude advantage. Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding 21st Bomber Command, had gambled that Japanese night fighters and anti-aircraft defenses couldn't coordinate effective response at low altitude in darkness. He was correct. Stripped of defensive guns to maximize incendiary payload, the bombers released 1,665 tons of M69 cluster bombs, each cluster containing 47 6-pound bomblets filled with gelid gasoline. 300,000 individual incendiary elements rained across the target area. The fire density exceeded anything ever attempted in warfare. Within 30 minutes, isolated fires had merged into a unified conflagration, generating winds exceeding 60 miles per hour. A firestorm that consumed oxygen, collapsed buildings, and incinerated everything combustible across 16 square miles. 100,000 people died that night, more casualties than Hiroshima or Nagasaki would suffer 5 months later. 267,000 buildings burned. 1 million people became homeless. The firestorm generated temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to boil the Sumida River, melt glass, and reduce human bodies to ash. Fire departments were overwhelmed within the first hour. Water mains ruptured from heat. Fire breaks were meaningless against winds that hurled flaming debris across streets and rivers. The urban vulnerability Major Mori had calculated, wooden construction, high density, narrow streets, manifested as Holocaust. 14 B-29s were lost, barely 4%. Physics and mathematics had predicted this outcome in November. March proved the calculations correct. Tokyo was the beginning, not the conclusion. Between March and August 1945, B-29s systematically destroyed 67 Japanese cities using the tactics proven in Operation Meeting House. Osaka burned on March 13th, 8 square miles destroyed. Nagoya on March 19th, 3 square miles consumed. Kobe on March 16th, 3 square miles ash. The Americans worked methodically through target lists compiled months earlier, executing strategic bombing with industrial precision. Approximately 178 square miles of urban Japan burned. 330,000 to 500,000 civilians died. Exact numbers remain disputed because records burned with the cities. 8.5 million became homeless. Industrial production collapsed not from direct factory hits but from destruction of workers' housing and urban infrastructure. Major Mori's 6-month prediction had been conservative. The campaign took 5 months. The altitude advantage that November's reconnaissance flight had revealed remained decisive throughout the campaign. Japanese air defenses never solved the fundamental problem. American bombers operated in airspace where Japanese fighters barely functioned. Even at the lower altitudes used for night incendiary raids, coordination challenges, darkness, and overwhelming numbers prevented effective interception. Loss rates averaged 0.5%, far below the 10 to 15% required for effective defense. The technology gap, training disparity, and production advantage documented in November 1944 determined outcomes in every engagement through war's end. Japan shot down 147 B-29s to all causes, combat, accidents, operational losses, out of 28,550 sorties, 0.5% loss rate. American factories replaced those losses in 5 days of production. Japan lost irreplaceable pilots attempting impossible intercepts. The ramming doctrine that Flight Sergeant Kashid had inaugurated on November 24th became formalized through the 244th Sentai and other special attack units. Approximately 300 ramming attacks were attempted against B-29s during the campaign. Success rate remained negligible. Most pilots couldn't reach intercept altitude, couldn't close to ramming distance, or survived collision attempts that damaged but didn't destroy bombers. The tactic demonstrated extraordinary courage and complete strategic bankruptcy simultaneously. When suicide is doctrine, mathematics has already decided the outcome. Major Mori's November assessment had concluded that defensive measures could delay but not prevent systematic urban destruction. Ramming attacks delayed nothing. The firebombing proceeded on schedule. August 1945 brought the campaign's conclusion through different means, atomic weapons and Soviet invasion, but strategic bombing had already achieved its objective. Japan's industrial capacity was shattered, urban population displaced, transportation infrastructure destroyed, food distribution broken, civilian morale collapsed. The Strategic Bombing Survey, compiled post-war, concluded that conventional bombing alone would have forced surrender by November 1945, even without atomic weapons or invasion. The interrogation of that first captured B-29 crew in November 1944 had revealed specifications that predicted this outcome. 20,000-pound bomb loads, 1,500-mile range, 30,000-foot altitude, pressurized cabins, 130-octane fuel. Each specification had contributed to defensive impossibility. Defensive impossibility had enabled unrestricted operations. Unrestricted operations against wooden cities had produced exactly the catastrophe Major Mori calculated. Today, B-29 superfortresses are preserved in museums worldwide, Enola Gay at the Smithsonian, Boxcar at the National Museum of the Air Force, others in scattered collections. They represent technological achievement and strategic bombing doctrine vindicated through industrial execution. Memorials in Tokyo, Osaka, and other burned cities remember both civilian victims and, remarkably, some of the approximately 500 American B-29 crew members captured during the campaign, many executed or dying in captivity as Japanese public rage grew with each city that burned. The November 24th, 1944 ramming attack is largely forgotten, overshadowed by the March firebombing and August atomic attacks. But that first engagement and subsequent interrogation established the mathematical framework that predicted everything following. Flight Sergeant Khashid's desperate collision destroyed one bomber but delivered its crew to interrogators who documented the technological superiority that physics and chemistry had created. Their testimony, extracted through 48 hours of questioning, confirmed specifications that proved Japan's wooden cities couldn't survive the campaign launching from Saipan. Major Mori's intelligence assessment gave Japanese leadership 6 months' warning. The warning was accurate within weeks. 67 cities burned exactly as calculated. 147 B-29s lost versus systematic urban destruction. The altitude advantage that seemed impossible on that November afternoon, 4 miles of empty air between Japanese pilots gasping for oxygen and American crews flying in shirt-sleeve comfort, became routine. Technology had created the gap. Interrogation had revealed it. Mathematics had calculated the outcome. March through August proved the calculation correct. 1 captured crew, 1 intelligence report, 1 terrible prophecy fulfilled with precision. 4 miles of empty air had determined the war's end.